It began before dawn, a chill morning over the airfields of eastern Poland, the silence shattered under the unmistakable growl of turbine engines that once haunted the nightmares of Soviet tank crews. Dozens of U.S. A-10 Thunderbolt II aircraft, the legendary Warthogs, emerged from the mist, their wings glinting beneath the rising sun. This was not a routine NATO rotation. This was a declaration, a message so loud it reached all the way to the Kremlin's war rooms. When the A-10 Warthogs roared north toward the Suwałki Gap, every radar from Kaliningrad to Belarus lit up in red. This narrow corridor, barely 65 kilometers wide, is NATO's Achilles heel, the thin stretch of land connecting Poland to Lithuania and the rest of the Baltic states. Military strategists have long warned that if Russia were ever to test NATO's unity, this would be the place. And now, for the first time in decades, that flashpoint was alive with American engines. Polish farmers near Augusta reported seeing low-flying formations skimming treetops, their wingtips almost brushing the pines. The aircraft flew in pairs, silent and disciplined, hugging the terrain to evade radar. To the untrained eye, it looked like routine practice. To defense experts, it was unmistakable combat pattern flying. The A-10s weren't rehearsing, they were preparing. NATO's command didn't hide the symbolism. As one senior officer told Reuters, visibility is deterrence. The Warthogs didn't sneak across Europe like stealth jets, they wanted to be seen. Their bulky frames, their signature growl, their legendary GAU-8 cannon, everything about them screamed message. A message to Moscow: the Suwałki Gap will not fall without a fight. In the Kremlin, the response was immediate. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu called an emergency meeting demanding full tracking of NATO flight paths. Kaliningrad's S-400 missile systems were activated and interceptors scrambled to shadow the American aircraft. For hours, Russian MiG-31 jets mirrored the A-10 patrols from a distance, maintaining visual contact but never engaging. The skies over Eastern Europe became a chessboard of power and restraint, each side daring the other to make a wrong move. Meanwhile, across NATO channels, the deployment evolved into a coordinated symphony of deterrence. Dutch F-16s, British Typhoons, and Polish F-35s joined the rotations, establishing round-the-clock coverage over the border corridor. The drills simulated scenarios of rapid Russian incursions, testing how fast air support could reach ground troops stationed along the frontier. Every sortie was timed, logged, analyzed, precision deterrence in motion. Local Polish newspapers captured the public mood perfectly. The angels of the East are watching. For villagers who had lived under the shadow of Kaliningrad's missiles for years, the daily rumble of A-10 engines became a strange kind of comfort. The symbolism was powerful. A country once divided and occupied by great powers now hosted one of the most formidable symbols of American air strength. But beneath the patriotic cheers lay a dangerous truth. The Suwałki Gap was not just geography, it was a fuse. Any miscalculation, a radar lock, a false alarm, a misinterpreted maneuver could set off a chain of escalation no side could fully control. NATO generals called it a corridor of peace protected by tension. Russian analysts called it a trap disguised as reassurance. And as the Warthogs continued their relentless patrols flying low through fog and forest, one question grew heavier in Moscow's Air Command Center. Was NATO defending its borders or rehearsing the first moves of a new Eastern Front? By the second week of deployment, the air over northern Poland had transformed into a theater of relentless precision. The A-10 Thunderbolt II fleet no longer sat idle on the tarmac. They were now flying low-altitude patrols in synchronized waves, each sortie accompanied by reconnaissance drones and radar jammers. To the casual observer, it was training. To anyone inside Moscow's intelligence network, it looked unmistakably like combat readiness. Satellite imagery from Reuters and DW confirmed what many suspected: American ground crews had set up forward arming and refueling points FARPs across eastern Poland temporary bases that allowed the Warthogs to land, reload, and relaunch within minutes. This was a Cold War tactic reborn for a new century. By scattering operations across rural zones, NATO ensured that even a sudden missile strike could not cripple its response. The message to the Kremlin was blunt: NATO can strike back instantly from anywhere. Witnesses near the Polish base of Łask described the scene like something out of history resurrected. Massive cargo planes C-17 Globemaster III had landed throughout the night, unloading metallic giants wrapped in gray covers guarded by American military police. Hours later, the coverings came off, revealing the unmistakable shark-mouth nose, art, and titanium armor plating of the A-10s. The aircraft that once dominated the deserts of Iraq and the mountains of Afghanistan now stood ready on Europe's front line once again. Behind the scenes, US and Polish commanders integrated real-time targeting systems between artillery units and A-10 strike formations. This meant that if Russian armor ever crossed the line, coordinates could be transmitted from ground observers to Warthog pilots in seconds. Every maneuver, every rotation was rehearsed with mathematical precision. The airfields of Łask-Powice and Minsk-Mazowiecki became humming centers of logistics and power, where American, British, and Polish crews worked shoulder to shoulder under floodlights. Meanwhile, Russia's own response exposed its mounting anxiety. In Kaliningrad, radar operators reported unidentified patterns across their defense grids. NATO's electronic warfare aircraft were blinding Russian surveillance systems, forcing their defenses to recalibrate. MiG-31 interceptors scrambled repeatedly, but every time they approached, the A-10s vanished under radar cover, hugging the terrain at tree level. Russia's S-400 batteries, once touted as invincible, struggled to track them. It was humiliation in slow motion. Moscow's state television tried to mask the tension, describing the A-10 as obsolete junk from a bygone era. Yet leaked Ministry of Defense memos painted a different story. Panic briefings scrambled shifts and orders to reposition mobile missile units closer to the Baltic coast. According to BBC analysis, Russia had quietly moved Iskander missile trucks into forested zones near the border, a desperate attempt to counter the psychological dominance NATO's aircraft had achieved. For the first time in years, NATO's deterrence wasn't theoretical. The A-10, with its titanium armor and armor-piercing GAU-8 cannon, symbolized something Moscow had not faced since the early 1990s: visible, persistent, fearless power. Each flight over the Suwałki corridor reminded Russia that any armored thrust westward would be met not with hesitation, but with overwhelming retaliation. To Poland and the Baltic nations, it was reassurance. To Russia, it was a nightmare playing out in real time. And as the Warthogs circled low over the horizon, their engines vibrating through the cold morning air, one fact became impossible to ignore. NATO's defensive shield had quietly evolved into a preemptive spear pointed straight at Russia's western flank. But the standoff was only beginning. In Moscow's shadowy defense command, a new strategy was already taking shape, one that would test NATO's nerves like never before. Inside the marble halls of the Russian National Defense Control Center, the atmosphere turned electric. Screens flickered with satellite feeds, radar plots, and grainy infrared visuals of NATO aircraft slicing across the Polish frontier. Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu leaned over the central console, his voice sharp: "Increase readiness in Kaliningrad. Move the S-400 units. Bring the MiG-31s to full alert." The order traveled instantly through encrypted channels, and within hours, Russia's western district was humming with activity. From space news satellite images told the story. Convoys of mobile missile batteries and electronic warfare trucks were spotted dispersing into forested zones along the Baltic coast. Russian warplanes took to the skies in aggressive patrols, and coastal radars began broadcasting at full power, flooding the spectrum in an effort to disrupt NATO's surveillance drones. Officially, Moscow called it routine defensive drills. Unofficially, it was panic management. Russian state TV rolled out its usual narrative. Anchors described the A-10 deployment as a symbolic act of intimidation, and assured viewers that modern Russian systems could easily neutralize outdated American aircraft. Yet behind the propaganda, even senior Russian analysts on channels like Tsargrad and Sputnik Military admitted a harsher truth. The A-10's low altitude and high survivability made them uniquely difficult to intercept. They weren't stealth fighters, they were armored predators designed to survive and return fire. As the Warthogs continued their patrols near the Suwałki Gap, Russian air defenses grew increasingly restless. Commanders worried about the psychological toll on their crews. Radar operators were forced to monitor dozens of new signals drones, decoys, and electronic noise generated by NATO's EC-130H Compass Call aircraft. According to a Deutsche Welle military correspondent, entire segments of Russia's radar coverage went blind for several minutes at a time. For a military obsessed with control, this was chaos. For Washington, this operation was officially labeled a training rotation, but analysts across NATO knew better. It was strategic theater. The timing was no coincidence. As Russian pressure on NATO's eastern border intensified, the Pentagon moved one of its most feared symbols of battlefield dominance right to the edge of Kaliningrad. The roar of the GAU-8 Avenger cannon, a weapon that can fire almost 4,000 rounds a minute, echoed through the minds of Moscow's generals. Meanwhile, within NATO's Joint Air Command in Ramstein, Germany, planners watched Russia's every move with calm precision. Intelligence feeds from American RC-135 reconnaissance planes painted a clear picture. Russian units were overreacting, spreading themselves thin, burning through fuel and morale. A retired U.S. general told Defense News, "The A-10s are doing exactly what they were brought to do: force Russia to show its cards without firing a shot." The tactic worked. Moscow's frantic mobilization revealed its vulnerabilities: logistical strain, low maintenance readiness, and pilot fatigue. Every takeoff and landing consumed resources Russia could no longer easily replace. Years of sanctions and supply shortages had eroded its air force's resilience. The more Russia tried to respond, the more it exposed its weaknesses to NATO's surveillance network. But the danger was real. The closer the A-10s flew, the thinner the line between deterrence and confrontation became. One misinterpreted radar lock, one nervous pilot's reaction, could trigger a spiral of escalation. European diplomats quietly urged restraint, but the momentum had shifted. The US had forced Russia into a reactive posture, one step behind, one decision too late. Still deep in Moscow, a different mindset was taking shape. Putin's inner circle began crafting a countersignal, something that would reclaim the narrative and reassert dominance. That signal would soon thunder back across the Baltic skies, and the world would hold its breath as the next move unfolded. Within 72 hours of the A-10's full deployment, Russia answered not with diplomacy, but with spectacle. Across Kaliningrad, the night sky lit up with trails of missile launches, the crackling glow of Iskander ballistic drills reflected over the Baltic waters. State television broadcast the footage on a loop columns of armored vehicles rolling through forests, bombers streaking across the horizon, patriotic music roaring behind every explosion. The message was unmistakable. Russia was not afraid. Yet behind the theater, the mood in Moscow was far from confident. According to Reuters and BBC monitoring, leaked military briefings revealed serious cracks in Russia's readiness. Pilots were stretched thin, rotated between multiple fronts, and spare parts, for aircraft were increasingly scarce. Fuel convoys had to be escorted due to drone threats inside Russian territory. As one retired colonel admitted anonymously, "We can roar for the cameras, but our claws are dull." Still, the Kremlin needed control of the narrative. It framed NATO's deployment as an aggression of the West, accusing Washington of turning Poland into a launch pad for provocation. Propaganda anchors declared that Russia could wipe out NATO airfields in minutes with precision missiles. But experts watching from Berlin and London noted the inconsistencies: missile tests without verified targets, edited footage from past exercises, and soundtracks louder than the truth itself. Meanwhile, NATO's operations only grew bolder. US A-10s began conducting live fire drills over Poland's northern ranges, firing their GAU-8 Avenger cannons into reinforced mock targets. The sound, a brutal mechanical roar, rolled across the countryside like thunder. Locals described it as both terrifying and exhilarating. "It's the sound of protection," a Polish veteran told DW, "the sound that tells Moscow we are not alone." On the tactical level, NATO's coordination reached unprecedented precision. American Warthogs practiced joint targeting with Polish artillery, while British Typhoons simulated interception runs against hypothetical Russian incursions. Each mission was tracked by AWACS surveillance planes, their radar dishes scanning every kilometer of the frontier. It wasn't just deterrence anymore, it was rehearsal. To the Kremlin, this sight carried an unmistakable warning. The A-10s were built for one mission, destroying tanks and fortifications. And there they were, just minutes from Russian soil. The world's most rugged, close air support aircraft, capable of withstanding direct anti-aircraft hits, had arrived where Russian armor drills had become routine. NATO's message was clear: the age of passive defense was over. In Brussels, NATO's top command framed the show of force as controlled escalation. It was designed to demonstrate strength without crossing the line into direct conflict. But Russia's leadership didn't see control, it saw encirclement. For Moscow, every low-flying A-10, every signal from AWACS, every radar ping from Lithuania's air defense systems was a reminder that NATO's presence was no longer symbolic. It was operational. And as both sides played their deadly game of brinkmanship, European citizens watched uneasily. Germany and France voiced diplomatic concern, calling for de-escalation through dialogue. But smaller nations, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, privately urged Washington to keep the Warthogs flying. For them, the deterrence was personal. The paradox was now complete. What began as a message of defense had evolved into a permanent confrontation in motion. Russia could no longer claim dominance over its western frontier. Every move it made was tracked, measured, and anticipated by NATO's unblinking eyes. Yet the question that haunted both sides remained: how long could this balance of fear last before the first spark broke containment? The answer would begin to emerge as the skies over Poland filled not only with Warthogs, but with whispers of an even greater escalation on the horizon. By late October 2025, the skies over Poland were no longer a symbol of peace. They were an electric nerve stretched to breaking point. Every dawn began with the distant thunder of engines, the rhythmic rumble of A-10 Warthogs slicing through the mist above Polish farmland. Farmers paused their tractors to look up. School children pointed as the gray aircraft banked low across the horizon. NATO's deterrent had become a daily ritual, a reminder that Europe was living one heartbeat away from confrontation. Inside NATO's Joint Air Command reports poured in of increasing Russian aerial activity. MiG-31s shadowed Allied flights across the Baltic Sea, while Su-34 bombers simulated attack runs near Lithuania's coast. Electronic warfare intensified, jammers, radar interference, and false signals flooded the spectrum. In response, the U.S. Air Force quietly increased the number of reconnaissance flights, and for the first time in years, AWACS radar planes operated continuously over Eastern Europe. The chessboard was now in full motion. Defense experts describe the standoff as an old war reborn in a modern shell. The A-10s, once destined for retirement, had forced Moscow into a strategic dilemma. They couldn't be easily targeted, they didn't rely on stealth, and their armor made them nearly indestructible against small missiles. For Russia, the sight of these rugged, low-flying aircraft operating confidently along its borders was a humiliation, a reminder that NATO could project power without apology. In Washington, Pentagon analysts briefed President Trump on the unfolding tension. The message was firm: deterrence was holding, but barely. Every sortie, every radar lock risked misunderstanding. And yet the strategy worked. Russian ground activity slowed convoys near Kaliningrad, moved cautiously, and troop morale reportedly dipped under constant surveillance. The Warthogs had achieved what no stealth jet could. They changed behavior simply by being seen. Meanwhile, within the Kremlin, frustration festered. Putin's advisors warned that the A-10 deployment had shifted the psychological balance. Russia was reacting, not dictating. Its once powerful narrative of dominance had fractured under the weight of NATO's persistence. The Suwałki Gap, once seen as an opportunity for pressure, had become a fortress of vigilance. Polish locals lined the fences, phones raised high, watching the spectacle unfold. The engines thundered like rolling storms over the plains, a sound older Poles remembered from American exercises in the Cold War. They came back, one farmer whispered to a journalist, eyes fixed on the low-flying formation cutting across the morning sky. In that moment, Poland felt the shadow of history lifting. The world watched as the skies remained tense but silent. For now, no shots were fired. The A-10s kept circling their cannons, loaded, their pilots alert. To Poland and the Baltic nations, these aircraft were angels, guardians of peace through strength. To Moscow, they were an unblinking challenge, proof that the Cold War's echoes still haunted modern geopolitics. And somewhere between Warsaw and Kaliningrad, as the Warthogs glided above the clouds, a question lingered. How long can deterrence hold before fear becomes a spark? The events unfolding along the Polish border mark more than a military maneuver, they mark a psychological turning point in modern Europe. The return of the A-10 Thunderbolt is not nostalgia, it is strategy written in steel and sound. NATO has proven that deterrence does not require invisibility. Sometimes it demands being seen, being heard, and being ready. To the Kremlin, this operation sent a message that cannot be ignored. The age of uncontested skies is over. To the people of Poland and the Baltic states, it offered something more powerful than reassurance. It offered presence. The Warthog's low growl across the horizon has become the heartbeat of NATO's eastern defense line, a living promise that aggression will not go unanswered. But the story does not end here. Every deployment, every radar scan, every diplomatic statement adds weight to a fragile balance that could tilt at any moment. One miscalculation could transform deterrence into disaster. One misunderstanding could rewrite the map of Europe overnight. As the world watches the skies of Eastern Europe shimmer under jet exhaust and winter fog, one truth stands clear. Peace today depends not on distance, but on vigilance. What do you think? Has NATO's show of strength truly kept the peace, or has it simply moved the world one step closer to a new Cold War? Stay with us for continuing coverage, analysis, and unfolding developments. Subscribe, comment your thoughts below, and join the discussion, because the next move in this silent air war could decide the future of Europe itself. Inside Russia's defense ministry, confusion turned to alarm. Radar operators near Kaliningrad and Belarus reported multiple low-altitude targets moving in precise formation along the border. Within hours, the Russian media began spinning the story, calling the move provocative and unjustified. Yet behind closed doors, officials knew what it really meant. NATO had brought a tank-killer force to their doorstep. By midday, satellite imagery confirmed what intelligence analysts had suspected. For weeks, fully armed A-10s were stationed across Polish bases, coordinated with F-16s from the Netherlands and Typhoons from the UK. It was not an isolated deployment, but part of a carefully choreographed deterrence network. The stage was set and tension rippled through Europe. From Warsaw to Moscow, one question echoed across military briefings and newsrooms alike. Was this merely a show of strength or the prelude to something far greater? The answer would soon emerge in the next phase, when the Warthogs took to the skies over the Suwałki Gap, NATO's most fragile link to the Baltic states.